Hello and welcome. In this episode, we are talking about the ongoing Ukrainian offensives, as well as let's talk about more news from the Russian mobilization and the problems evolving from it. First off, we started with some news from Kiev. There are now reports of the first attack inside of the Kiev region for several weeks. Apparently, with Shahid 136 drones, the Russians attacked a military base of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. We can see here it's already burning. And you hear the high-pitched noise of a drone, and there it's coming down. It hitting, and we can see the aftermath here. You see several buildings being hit, and as we can see, at least unless there is some effective defense, those drones seem to be fairly accurate, like we can see here. When we talk about the Ukrainian offensive into Luhansk, because that's what we need to talk about, that's what we probably have to call it by now. The Ukrainians are advancing further in the direction of Svatove, and the Russians are now preparing for its defense. We have a video here of some trench digging equipment. Those are meant to, that's actually a machine to dig a trench for infantry to fight in. As you can see, the baskets here, those are obviously meant to dig in and pull the earth out. So bygone to the time of our grandfathers who had to dig those trenches with a pickaxe and a spade. The Ukrainians are advancing further in that direction, but not just in this. From Russian Telegram, according to it, a military blogger is saying the Ukrainians are right at Orlianka. Supposedly at that point when he wrote it, Orlianka was still in Russian hands. There are some reports about the Russians withdrawing from Kherson, from Kharkiv Oblast. Supposedly it's freed. As of now, I cannot see any proof as of yet, but it seems to indicate that they are actually withdrawing slowly further to the east and by getting away into better defensible positions. It's too early to confirm that Kharkiv is fully liberated as of now, but it's probably close to the Ukraine is probably close to achieving that goal as of now. There are reports about fighting along the road between Svatove and Kremina down here. It's unclear whether the Russians can still use it. They themselves talk about infiltration troops, so that would likely be special forces that went behind Russian lines to do recon and interdict troop movement along the road here. The Russians seem to put an effort in to defend that ground line of communications, and I have not seen proof yet of regular main spearheads of the Ukrainian forces having cut those, but Russian Telegram channels report that driving that road is no longer recommended, so there must be some interdiction by Ukrainian forces already. We have to say, though, that those units they are sending there are still the old units that have withdrawn from the Izium and Liman area, so a lot of those units are more or less destroyed at a fraction of their usual combat power, and the reports about reinforcements arriving there are really sparse, so it's highly doubtful that the Russians will be able to stabilize a front line between Svatove and Kremina anytime soon. So what we can expect now is them probably being pushed further back. And that seems to be necessary, or is necessary, as we have more reports now about war crimes. The Ukrainian side are saying that they found mass graves with 50 civilians in them in Liman. Obviously, at this point, there might be various explanations for those. Even from what I've seen, the Ukrainians do not claim yet that those civilians have been tortured or have been executed by Russian forces. In theory, those could be civilians that died from artillery shelling or something like this. But obviously, it wouldn't be too much of a surprise if we hear about further cases of war crimes committed by the Russian forces, which unfortunately have become a common occurrence in this war. The Russians, further south, the Russians keep up their attacks, more or less pointless attacks, more between Siversk and Bakhmut, or somewhat further south towards Horlivka. The Ukrainian forces claim that they repulsed every single attack. And we have still Russian claims that Russian forces are within Bakhmut. But even after claiming that for probably close to a week by now, I have not seen any photographic or video proof of Russian forces actually being in the city of Bakhmut, despite their numerous claims. Further south, we have continuous attacks around Avdiivka. Again, they are still trying to achieve something and pushing the Ukrainians out, probably by bypassing them and threatening encirclement. But all those attacks have been fruitless as well for the past weeks. Further south, we have Russian fear of the Russians being afraid of coming big offensive by the Ukrainians. There are talks, the Russian telegram sources are claiming that Tokmak and Melitopol are likely targets. We can see that here, that supposedly, that's from Raiba, that they are going to push down. As you can see here, it says Armed Forces of Ukraine planned attack. Now, where they would know that from, obviously, we can't really say, but at least if they actually have the strength to do that, that would probably be a likely goal to reach both Melitopol and Berdyansk, and thus cutting all lines of communications further west to Kherson and on the land bridge towards Crimea. And in an attack this wide, it would obviously have the stability and the chance to defend against Russian counterattacks in this way. The Russian side has reported for weeks now a massive movement of troops, of Ukrainian troops, towards the southern front line here. So far, we have not seen any proof of coming big counterattack. Obviously, the Ukrainians would, in this case, not announce it. The last episodes, I talked about probing attacks, probably recon attacks in this area here, which would then indicate that the Raiba guess that the offensive might go down here might actually have some salt to it. What's interesting, though, is also that we see here them expecting or announcing a coming amphibious attack across the reservoir, more or less here. In theory, that seems at first glance, that seems almost impossible. But regarding the fact how weak the Russian forces are in manpower right now, the defense they can put up on the other side of the reservoir must be more or less negligible. If the Ukrainians actually manage to find barges that can house tanks and unload them on the other side, it might even be possible for them to perform an amphibious attack, as the Russians don't have like combat ships on the reservoir, and that as their forces, their armed forces on the other side, in those areas where there's no active combat, can't be more than symbolic. So we'll have to keep an eye on that, whether Raiba, which is pro-Russian, might actually be true in this regard, whether they might indicate something that is going to happen. But as of now, this is hardly more than their fantasy or that their guesswork, what might be a theoretic possibility. Other than that, Putin has decreed that the Zaporizhzhia power plant will be handed over to Rosenergatom, Goatom, which is a Russian nuclear power plant company, and thus he basically decreed it's being taken away from Ukraine and is now a Russian property after his signing and ratifying of the annexations of the 4 provinces. In Kherson, the Ukrainian attacks on the Russian logistics, storage facilities, command structures, and strong points continue, as we can't be really much surprised of this yet. But the other than that, we see reports about Ukraine consolidating their gains here, but that they follow up on Russian withdrawal. But the indications so far are that this time the withdrawal has been more or less successful. I'm still missing the big reports about captured equipment, so we can guess that the majority of the Russian forces in this area here has been able to withdraw successfully, not only with most of their manpower, but also with most of their equipment. And this time we have also reports that the Russians actually blow up blow up ammo dumps they left behind after the harsh criticism from the defeats in Izium, for instance, where they handed over huge stockpiles of basically everything to the Ukrainians. This must have reached now the Russian side, and this time they seem to put more emphasis on not arming their enemies by blowing up the depots when they have to withdraw. According to Russian sources, the Russians are now withdrawing towards Milove. I have no report yet about where the Ukrainians are themselves at this point, but Russian maps more or less indicate that their forces are close to Milove. So it's probably the point that they're already pushing further than we can see on this map, which is usually not the most accurate when it comes to the time frame. So they are usually a day or two behind. Milove, on the other hand, is now 36 kilometers away from Novakharkovka. So in this case, base bleed grenades 155 of several of the artillery pieces might already be in range to shell one of the most important crossing points for the Russians, and thus making the situation much more dangerous than it already is. Further south, we also have reports now the Russians are talking about big Ukrainian troop concentrations in Posad Pokrovske, which is here, also in Ternovi Pori, which was here, I think. Yeah, it's here. And in Oleksandrivka. So according to the Russian reports, we are to expect a further attack from the south, or from the west, if you want it this way, in the southern side of the bridgehead towards Kherson itself. It's increasingly becoming more likely that Kherson will be in Ukrainian hands before the year's end, and thus where this would allow the Ukrainians to inflict a strategic defeat to Russia, as Kherson is basically the key, the gate to Mykolaiv and Odessa. Once they've lost it, their chance of regaining it and their chance of ever threatening Odessa again seems more or less negligible at this point. Now let's come, this is it about the invasion here. What we can fastly conclude is that the Ukrainians still hold the initiative on both front lines. It seems that they are more or less going after the Russian forces in the north. The fighting itself doesn't seem to be too intense. If the Russians withdraw fast, they obviously have to be slow enough to not run into minefields, to do demining, get booby traps, etc. Make sure they don't run into an ambush. But they seem to be pushing after the Russian forces, and we can expect the fighting to go on, to continue probably fairly soon, as we can see now that the Ukrainians are far from the accumulation point of their offensive on the Kherson bridgehead. The Russians themselves indicate there might be a further attacks coming towards Kherson city itself within the next few days. Further north, also, again, we see the Ukrainians still advancing, so any accumulation point here is still far away. Ukraine is advancing, and the troops they are facing are mostly more or less destroyed units that they have already beaten in the regions of Kupiansk, Izium, and Liman, and the fresh troops that are arriving, that's when we're coming to mobilization, will neither have the skill nor the motivation, the morale to strengthen the Russian defensive lines at this point, that it seems likely that the Russians will be able to stop the Ukrainians here. So in both fronts, we should expect the Ukrainians to advance further and liberate more of their territory. Now let's come to the mobilization. Shoigu has said that 200,000 have been mobilized, and they are currently being trained on 80 training sites and 6, I would understand that as military academies. They are trained before they're being deployed in Ukraine. But there are numerous videos of mobilized people who are saying they have been sent without any training to speak of and are already being sent to the front line. We also have reports from Ukraine, which could obviously be propaganda at times, but them claiming that the first Russian soldiers are calling the capitulation hotline that Ukraine set up and giving themselves up to save their lives. And those are also saying they've been mobilized 5 days ago and are already in Ukraine and they don't want to die, so they hand them over. All of this is an indication how dire the situation is being judged, but at the same time, even pushing in those people will not change a lot There is no way of seeing, of indication that those fast reinforcements should change anything along the front line. We have further reports. The so-called Donetsk People's Republic are saying that freshly mobilized people are arriving there, and supposedly some of them are training on training grounds within the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. Other Russian sources are talking about freshly mobilized people that are training in Ukraine itself, or they would obviously call it in the new provinces of Russia. So they are training somewhere in this area here in the occupied territory of the Ukrainian state. Shoigu also said the mobilized will reinforce existing units and not create new ones, which would mean that the destroyed units should be more or less fastly reinforced. But at the same time, the Ukrainian side has reported that a motorized rifle division has been formed on Crimea and will be staffed with people from Crimea, Krasnodar, Krim, I think, Krasnodar Krai, and like from other regions close by that are being sent to staff the new rifle division that is being created on the Crimea. But all of it shows that the mobilized people will likely being sent to the front line really fast, and that would be an indication that those units that have been in combat since March, basically since February, that it seems unlikely that they will be rotated out, which would be possible if the mobilized people would create new units, thus allowing the veterans to regenerate, to rest for a little, to be refreshed then. Other than that, no, it seems they are pushing the new men into it and thus eating up the veterans in the following combat that is coming here, and probably not the smartest choice, as the gain in combat power will not be justified by the exhaustion that is being held up, the level of exhaustion that's going to be held up by the units that are staying on the front line despite the theoretical chance of rotating them out. There are also further reports and further indications that the mobilization is mostly focusing ethnic minorities and the lower classes, so the poor areas of Russia, whereas like Moscow and St. Petersburg, which according to Russian understanding are the only two cities that count, are more or less being untouched by it. In Dagestan, for instance, we have news that the mortality rate, so the number of people dying, has increased by 105% since the beginning of the war, whereas in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the number has risen by 0 to 3%. This is just an indication how much ethnic minorities are being used up in this war, and which would indicate coming further problems when it comes to the question of loyalty from those ethnic minorities once they realize that they are being used as cannon fodder to save ethnic Russians from the hardships of the war. We have further massive videos about from freshly mobilized people. I have one here which is indicating the catastrophic situation they are currently in.
Ни одно оружие не вписано ни на одного человека. Уголовного кодекса Российской Федерации. Автоматы списаны со склада, нигде не числятся. Вооружение 70-х, 80-х годов. Температура, люди болеют, пневмония, заболевания, у всех температура. У большей части состава нет ни касок, ни бронежилетов.
And there are tons of videos of this, and this scene alone was filmed from several angles. In some of them you see Russian soldiers showing thermometers showing that they have fever right now and are still among that group. So we don't really know how much of this is authentic. It can't be fully said, but the number of videos is at least some indication. But what was obvious in those pictures is the surprisingly high number of soldiers showing balaclavas, which doesn't make too much sense unless it's already that cold that they would need it, or that they want to prevent detection. And there are some rumors, at least on the internet, that those might be instigated protests from Wagner mercenaries to help further Prigozhin, I think is his name, Prigozhin's political goals by showing this way to the Russian public how bad Shoigu does his job, and we might find out that Prigozhin, I think. I'm sorry. That the basically the founder of Wagner, Prigozhin, I think is his name, that he actually might want to become defense minister, because there's increasingly more indications that he wants to show an image of him being something like a defense minister. So we might see that as soon as Putin gets rid of Shoigu, whom he'll use as a scapegoat, that much should be more or less clear by now, that Prigozhin might become the new minister of defense within the Russian Federation. In this context, we also have the news that Kadyrov has now said that he was promoted by Putin to Colonel General. So he has now the same rank as Colonel General Lapin, who was the commander of the area of Liman, and Kadyrov has openly and very vocally attacked Lapin in the past because of the bad defense of Liman. This again shows us some infighting within Russia, that the government Putin seems to try to keep the Siloviki happy. So those with a power base, among which usually Kadyrov is being counted, but the infighting itself will cause increased problems for Putin, as the military is far from happy of being told they are incompetent by an upstart mercenary leader like Prigozhin or from Kadyrov. This is more or less it what I have for now from the mobilization. We have a few more things, like we have this video here, for instance, which is now being sent around, of Russian soldiers in a BMP capitulating, and you see him coming here, and you see the white flags, and you see all the Ukrainian soldiers being fairly relaxed, and at the same time, while they are in cover, the cameraman apparently is openly visible without cover, and not just holding it on a selfie stick, but it seems that he's zooming in. So while it is possible, and supposedly they're trying it, they said it from the beginning, if Russian soldiers are handing over their equipment, they're going to get financial rewards for that. They are going to help Russian soldiers to desert, to switch sides, more or less. While this is theoretically possible, all in all, this video seems to be more or less staged, and is now being spread around by pro-Ukrainian channels and even the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine by now, as an example of Russian soldiers capitulating and handing over their equipment. Now, while I can't say that this is definitely fake, as said, for me it looks a little weird, but again, this is war, and the Ukrainian side has every reason to try to create videos and images that makes them look good, and that might even make further Russian soldiers actually do this, which might have been staged here. I said there's no way for us to likely say it in the near future what was the actual case here. This might be staged, this might not be staged, but the video is currently going around, and I at least wanted to voice some doubts about how it is done, that it kind of feels a little not fully authentic. We have an interesting video here too about the Ukrainian sides using a anti-drone system, EDM-4S, against a DJI Mavic drone that is in use by the Russians, supposedly. We see that here, and we see the humming. And here's the drone coming. I think I need to turn off the music, otherwise I'm gonna get some copyright problems. And they're capturing it here. And the system, I didn't know it, so I looked for it. This is it here. EDM4S Skywiper. It's made in Lithuania and it sends an electromagnetic pulse and is meant for like commercial drones. So obviously military drones should be hardened against it. And from the understanding, as we could see here, it has to be permanently pointed at the drone, which then loses contact with its navigation and especially with the controller, and thus it either does an emergency landing, as we can see here in the video, or it returns home. So in both cases it basically can't fulfill its duty. In this case it even allowed the Ukrainian forces to capture the drone themselves. And the last information I have is from General Sir Richard Barons. He's retired general. He said on Forces News that Ukraine will likely need $6 billion per month to finance its state, and a yearly support of 30 to 40 billion US dollars in military aid to keep up the fight. Just to add some numbers to what degree Ukraine might need aid in financial terms when it comes to the overall financing of the war. So 6 billion a month would obviously mean 72 billion a year, plus another 30 to 40. So according to his estimates, the most Ukraine would need is more or less $112 billion a year to keep fighting Russia and to keep being a competitive opponent for the Russian armed forces with a chance of winning the war. That's it for now from my side. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please, this channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. So I want to say my heartfelt thank you to everyone already supporting the channel. If you also want to support the channel, you find the options for that in the description. Other than that, you can obviously also support the channel by hitting the like button and commenting to help with the algorithm. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and share the channel with friends and acquaintances, and don't forget to hit the bell button so you don't miss future videos. That's it from my side for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.